Welcome back, everyone, and this is lecture one for the module on patriarchy and masculinity. Let's get into it. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about patriarchy during module one, the F word, when you started this course. But in this lecture, we're going to break this down some more, which will help you for your assignment. Now, using the same working definition that we had before, patriarchy, simply put, is a system of society or government in which men largely hold power and women are largely excluded. And truthfully, when we look at the numbers in regards to people in positions of authority, how much owns the wealth, many other aspects as well, we can safely say that we do still live in a patriarchal society. Doesn't mean that it hasn't gotten better. It certainly has. But when we sort of just look at the number of like how many men versus women are, for example, uh, in positions of leadership at large companies, most of it's men. But here's the thing, and this is what we're going to be talking about more. We need to unpack this some more because we need to think about this. Like, why is focusing just on men having power over women or value more than women doing an injustice to how patriarchy actually works in the world? One point that I'm getting to is that too often patriarchy is framed as a woman's problem, meaning that, like, it's only women who suffer from patriarchy, or it's only women who want to tear it down. So, first off, as we're going to talk about, patriarchy affects us all, even those who might benefit from a patriarchal system, i.e., men. Because one thing, as you will read about in the readings for this module, patriarchy does not benefit all men equally. It's not that if you were born male that you get a golden ticket to success. And in fact, part of patriarchy is about that it's not just the devaluing and repression of women, but also devaluing and repression of other men, particularly men of color, men with disabilities, men who are poor, men who are immigrant, and so forth. Also, it's not, and therefore, then, patriarchy is not a woman's issue, or is not only something that women want to tear down. There are many men, a good majority of men, who feel that this system needs to be taken down because we all suffer from it. And we'll look more into like how patriarchy particularly affects the mental, physical, just social well-being of young men and boys. I like to sort of talk about these core principles of patriarchy. The readings for this module also go into more detail for it, but I do believe that this is also a good working definition and will give just more added understanding of what patriarchy is and what it entails. So I love this quote by Alan Johnson in this piece, The Gender Not Unraveling Our Patriarchal Legacy. He writes, patriarchy does not refer to any man or collection of men, but to a kind of society in which men and women participate. That's really important. As I said on Module 1, it's not about hating a certain man or men in general. It's about the system that creates these privileges. A society is patriarchal to the degree that it promotes male privilege by being male dominated, male identified, and male centered. It is also organized around an obsession with control and involves as one of its key aspects the oppression of women. So let's break this down even more. So, as Alan Johnson writes about male dominance, what is that? Male dominance essentially is the positions of authority are generally reserved for men. Well, again, if you look at the numbers, and it is getting better, but truthfully, when we even look at our government, those who sit in Senate or even higher offices within states, they are mostly men. And it's something to think about is why aren't there more women in these positions of authority? Male identified. Core cultural ideas about what is considered good, desirable, preferable, or normal are associated with how we think about men and masculinity, meaning that we give much more value or benefits or positive sort of worth to what we as society have socially deemed for men. So, whether that's physical strength, bravery, toughness, not crying, not being emotional, so forth. And therefore, then, even women who have those traits, which most women do, being strong, being brave, sometimes not being emotional, all that, is valued less in women or seen as that women must strive to be more like men. Forgetting the fact that also men like women are complex beings, meaning that there are men who are not as physically strong or cry or aren't the providers or aren't necessarily leaders but wonderful valuable components of our society. Again, what makes society patriarchal is not necessarily that these traits are strictly held by men, but that we have signed sort of this gendered narrative around it that masculine traits, what we have socially constructed and idealized as masculine traits, are valued over feminine traits. That's where you get the things like you run like a girl, don't hit like a girl, stop crying like a girl. What does that mean then when we use those comments? Well, we're basically saying that acting like a girl is wrong, right? Even to other girls, I've heard this comment like, stop crying like a little girl to other girls. So again, it's a devaluing of women as well as a devaluing of men. Male centeredness means that the focus of attention is primarily on men and what they do. We will see this a lot in regards to media, and we're going to be talking about this more when we talk about representation, but that the media is very much skewed to male desire, wants, and needs. And for young women, especially living up in a culture where it is very male centered, women then feel like they must have to compete against one another for male attention. And then lastly, male control, which functions to preserve male privilege by controlling women and men, again, who might threaten it. So, again, these are sort of the core features of patriarchy. All of them are very much present within our society. I've given a little couple of examples. We can definitely see more, and especially the film that you're going to be watching, The Masculinity, will go into much more detail about this. At the heart of it, when we're talking about patriarchy, I really want you all to take away that it's not just an issue for women or that women are the only ones who are fighting about it or care. Because the truth is that patriarchy not only devalues women, but it devalues men. And even for those who might benefit from patriarchy because of the luck of the lottery of life, they still have women in their lives. They still have other men in their lives who don't benefit from this system. So we all should care about it. Because again, if feminism is about equality, and I think everybody, regardless of none of you identify as a feminist, want a world of equality for everyone, then we should care about the systems that oppress so many within our society, that being patriarchy. Okay, so now we're going to move forward a bit and talk and connect patriarchy to the discussions around masculinity and especially unpack a term called hegemonic masculinity. And this will all add up to discussing and helping you with the assignment where you're going to be watching the documentary The Mask You Live In. So I want to set the stage a bit around what is really a crisis in masculinity here in this country as well as in the world. In the US, men represent 99% of mass shootings, 80% of arrests for violent crimes, 98.9% of arrests for rape, 87% for robbery and burglary, 80% for motor vehicle theft, 79% for offenses against family and children, 77% for aggravated assault, and men make up the majority of the prison population. Now, these are very alarming statistics. It's important, again, remember from the module of the last module on gender construction, where I argued that nobody is born 100% genetically male or female, and in fact, many of these sort of physiological, biological, mental traits are between like what like that men are this way, women are that way are actually not existent. And the fact that there's incredible amounts of variety. What I'm trying to get is that just because someone is born male does not mean that they are naturally more aggressive, more inclined for theft, more inclined for violence. Not at all. In fact, we all start off pretty much the same. So instead of thinking about it biologically that men are just this way, maybe we should think about the society that particularly boys and young men are living that then shapes them into the men they become. And then on the flip side of this alarming statistic is that men have about 3.5% higher suicide rate than women. Men die from cardiac failure to a higher rate than women. Men have higher rates of alcohol and substance abuse, and men die more often than car accidents and reckless driving. Again, as I was saying about in the last slide, if we if we sort of put aside this idea that men are biologically more inclined to do things, we need to think about the culture then that we are growing up in that causes these things to occur, such as the fact that there is incredible amounts of shame in regards to mental health for men. Maybe that's why we have such high suicide rates, because there are so many boys, young men, and men who feel shame to get help. Cardiac failure, as well as substance and alcohol abuse. Maybe we should think about how society puts limits on men in regards to one talking about their stress, dealing with addictions, and so forth. Same thing for car accidents and reckless driving. We have this culture where men must prove themselves, must be dangerous, must be reckless, and then we suffer the consequences of it. Again, all of these things that I've talked about, also within the last slide, are going to be very much present in The Mask You Live In, which is the film you're going to be watching. But the question then is this is that, okay, so these are horrific statistics. I don't want to see these statistics. Why is it that then men and boys are disproportionately likely to perpetrate so many forms of violence as well as to suffer certain forms of violence? What is going on with men, young boys, and so forth? And what can we do? So, in order to all unpack this, we really need to look at society and how we construct masculinity and how we organize it. Now, it's important to state that our ideas today around what it means to be a man and, the ideas around masculinity that we have are very much historically and cultural constructions, meaning that they have changed through time and they change from cultures. So it's important to not think of it as just one thing. But at the heart of it, when we're thinking about masculinity, we should think about it more in plural. The same thing can go for femininity as well. That it's not just masculine, but masculinities, meaning that there's different ways, forms, and expressions of maleness, masculinity. And by doing that, by making it more plural, we are then talking largely about gender relations, particularly between men and women, as well as men between other men. Masculinities, it's important to say that when we're talking about masculinity, we're not talking about men as the problem. Instead, we're talking about the position of men in a very strict gender order that privileges certain sort of masculinities or masculine expressions and actions over others. And therefore, it's important to talk about how that these masculinities and this sort of hierarchy of masculinities is a pattern of practice that is reinforced by men as well as by women. So let's unpack this idea of a hierarchy of masculinities by looking at three popular cartoon characters. So the one on the left is Milhouse from The Simpsons. The other one in the middle is Butters from South Park. And then the last one on the right is Morty from Rick and Morty. Now, if we were in class, I would ask you this, but what makes these characters funny? Besides the fact that, like, horrific and as well as hilarious things happen to them. Why do we laugh at these characters, besides the fact that funny things happen to them and they're in a funny situation? Well, when usually I ask my students about this question, this is what they come up with, that the all three characters are very sensitive. They're kind of a bit nerdy. They aren't tough. They are super sweet. They're kind of a bit emotional. They're kind of like dorky and so forth, right? And the thing is to think about is that are we necessarily laughing with them when there's funny things that happen to them, or are we laughing at them? What is it about a character that, particularly a male character, who is not tough, who is maybe very interested in getting good grades, who is very super overly respectful or deferential or polite towards women? Why do we think that's funny? Because physicality doesn't necessarily mean anything. Being book smart or studying hard, that just shouldn't be something to laugh at. And being respectful and kind to other women also shouldn't be something that's funny. Yet all of us, myself included, laugh at these characters. What I'm getting to is that we laugh at characters like Milhouse because, regardless of not if you're consciously thinking about it, you are comparing Milhouse and his failure to live up to the ultimate ideas of masculine, right? Milhouse fails. He fails big time. He's neither strong, he's neither a leader, he's not a ladies' man, he's not tough, he's not, not emotional, all of these sort of things. And so it's again to think about, like, here's something that is a character that has been around for over 30 years, and we're still laughing at the same thing around his failure to be masculine. And the truth is, again, is that Milhouse or any of those cartoon characters that I showed you, they're not exceptions because we live in a culture, particularly a media culture, that really reinforces these ideas of what it means to be a real man, or at least traits within masculinities that we find the most desirable. So, whether that's having lots of money and being kind of like a baller, to like having lots of women, to being super tough, and so forth. And we see it everywhere, and it just sort of inundates us so much that we know already what is expected to be for men, like, if you wanted to live up to this ultimate masculinity, and then we laugh at characters who completely fail at it. This gets to the term that you're going to be unpacking in your assignment, hegemonic masculinity. Now, hegemonic is a very fancy term, but all it means is that it is ruling and dominant. So, what this means is that it is a form of masculinity that is very dominant and ruling and impacts our everyday life in pretty much every single way. So, hegemonic masculinity refers to this idea of a dominant, socially constructed form of masculinity which exists in this as being culturally exalted above other expressions of masculinity, as well as femininity. This sort of hegemonic idea contains a set of expectations for boys and men in the expression of their masculinity and stands as a normative conception to which men are held accountable. Meaning that there's this idea that there's this like ideal form of masculinity, and therefore every single person, men and women included, have to live up to it. So whether that's young men having to live up to this idea of what it means to be a man and the pressures of that, as well as women, feeling that they need to support that, as well as feeling and being valued less than that because they don't live up to these forms because they're not masculine. So, hegemonic masculinity is worldwide, meaning that in most cultures there's these ideas around what it means to be a real man. In the West, typically speaking, we see it as that you need to be super authoritative, hyper masculine, aggressive, and anti feminine. But here's the thing, no one can live up to hegemonic masculinity, men or women. But still, even though you can't live up to it, you're punished or feel less because you don't. So I have a picture there of a very famous action star named Chuck Norris with two guns and an American flag. And the reason why is that this is sort of a cultural idea or sort of visual idea of what hegemonic masculinity is, right? Like this idea form of masculinity who's very tough, authoritative, very physically fit, has lots of women, etc., right? But not even Chuck Norris, the person, meaning he is a real person, could live up to this idea of Chuck Norris. Because Chuck Norris, the person, he has his good days or his bad days. He probably cries. He probably doesn't feel so tough anymore. He probably can't like karate chop his way out of things, right? Because he's a human being, right? And that is the thing about hegemonic masculinity is that nobody can live up to it. Not even people that we sort of in our culture say like, "Oh man, that's the real guy." Like that is like the ultimate form of masculinity that we should all live up to because the truth is that humans, regardless if you're male, female, or across the gender spectrum, are complex, right? So, and have, and can't live up to these really unrealistic expectations. But regardless of that, we have this culture which sort of keeps on feeding it in that you have to live up to these, particularly men, that you have to live up to this, that you have to be not only incredibly physically fit, you must be also have not only be a ladies' man, but be domineering and sexually aggressive towards other women. And in that, also a rejection of any sort of sexual attraction towards other men, companionship, or so forth. These are other examples of hegemonic masculinity from, again, toughness to objectifying women to homophobia and so forth. When we talk about this sort of hierarchy of masculinities, what we're really talking about is how masculinities are valued over others. So at the top, you have what we've been talking about, hegemonic masculinity, which is the dominant form of masculinity that is expected in our society. While it may not be the most prevalent kind of masculinity, it is culturally valued the most. Qualities include heterosexuality, whiteness, physical strength, and suppression of emotions such as sadness. Again, this is the ultimate idea. And even though it's pretty much impossible to live up to, we still value it and see it as like, well, that's how we're supposed to be. Complicit masculinity is further down, where a man may not fit into all the characteristics of hegemonic masculinity, because no man could, but do not challenge it either. So even though you know you can't live up to it, you don't also challenge the idea that maybe this is unrealistic or even toxic. Since they are not challenging the systems of gender that are present in our societies, they do still receive benefits from male privilege. As you go further down, and this is why I'm talking about this hierarchy of masculinities, you have marginalized masculinity, where a man does not have access to this sort of hegemonic masculinity, again, this idea form of masculinity, because of certain characteristics such as his race, etc. However, these men subscribe to norms that are emphasized in hegemonic masculinity, including aggression, suppression of emotions such as sadness, and physical strength. Men of colored and disabled men are examples of men that experience marginalized masculinity. At the core of it, at the bottom, is subordinate masculinity, where men exhibit qualities that are opposite to those that are valued in hegemonic masculinity, such as physical weakness and an exhibition of emotions like sadness. Effeminate men and gay men are often put into these subordinate categories. And here's the thing, regardless of where you, family members, children, and so forth fit in, whether you, for some reason, could live up to the ultimate hegemonic masculinity or the further down the chain, we all suffer from it, particularly when we think about violence against men, because The rates of violence against men are epidemic, but the rates it's about violence against other men. And there are so many men out there who are suffering from mental health, from physical abuse, that aren't able to come forward because of these sort of very toxic norms around masculinity. So, we're going to be unpacking this more. And you're going to be unpacking this more with the documentary The Mask You Live In, as well as the photo voice project accompanying this film and the readings. Okay, I will talk about the assignment in lecture 2.